A Tale of the Wild West. Copper Creek, New Mexico Territory. 1873. The carriage hung suspended over Widow's Gorge like a broken bird, its splintered wood and torn leather testament to violence that had shattered the New Mexico morning. Blood streaked the doorframe in crimson ribbons, and beneath the wreckage far below, in the mist-shrouded depths, Clara Hammond's scream echoed against stone walls that had witnessed 1,000 deaths, but never one so deliberate. As consciousness fled her broken body, her fingers clutched something that shouldn't have been there, a child's wool blanket, impossibly small, impossibly stained with old blood that wasn't hers. In her delirium, she saw him again. Samuel, her baby boy. His blue eyes wide with accusation, his tiny lips moving in words she could never quite hear. "Mama," the vision whispered as darkness claimed her. "Why didn't you save me?" The outlaws above laughed like hyenas, their horses' hooves striking sparks from granite as they vanished into the desert heat, leaving only the sound of splintering wood and a mother's guilt plummeting toward an abyss that had claimed too many secrets. Clara Hammond had never intended to ride alone that morning. But guilt was a merciless companion that demanded solitude. At 29, she possessed the kind of beauty that frontier towns whispered about auburn hair, that caught sunlight like fire-green eyes, that held depths of sorrow she couldn't voice, and a spirit that had been slowly dying since the day they buried Samuel beneath the cottonwood behind their house. Her husband, Tom Sheriff of Copper Creek, had grown distant since their loss, spending long hours at his office and longer nights staring into whiskey bottles that never provided the answers he sought. The town folk meant well with their awkward condolences and sideways glances, but Clara felt their judgment like brands against her skin. They knew. Somehow they all knew it was her fault. The morning had begun with another of Dr. Marsh's visits, and the elderly physician arriving with his black bag and concerned expression. "Mrs. Hammond." He'd said, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he prepared another dose of laudanum. "You must try to sleep. These episodes, they're not healthy." But Clara had noticed how his eyes avoided hers when he spoke of Samuel's death, how his fingers lingered too long on the medicine bottles, and how he always seemed to know when Tom would be away. There had been whispers about Dr. Marsh rumors that drifted through Copper Creek like desert winds, stories of debts and desperate men of midnight visits that had nothing to do with medicine. When he'd left that morning, Clara had found a crumpled paper in the carriage, torn and blood-stained with words that made her blood run cold. "The Hammond woman knows too much. Make it look like an accident." Red Hawk watched the attack unfold from his perch high above the gorge, his scarred hands gripping the rifle that had become his only companion since the settlers had driven his people from their ancestral lands. At 32, the Cheyenne warrior bore the weight of too many losses, his sister Marie murdered by white men who faced no justice. His father, who had died of a broken heart on the reservation. His own exile from a tribe that could no longer afford to harbor one who refused to forgive. His weathered face, marked by a scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw, had frightened white settlers for years, but it was his eyes that truly unsettled them, dark pools that held the kind of pain that could drive a man to madness or to mercy. He had been tracking the men who killed Marie for 3 years, following a trail of violence that led always back to Copper Creek and the corrupt lawmen who protected their own. The woman's scream cut through his meditation like a blade through flesh. And Red Hawk found himself moving before his mind could form words of protest. He had sworn never to help. Another white settler had promised Marie's spirit that he would focus only on vengeance. But something about the way Clara Hammond fought against her attackers reminded him of his sister in her final moments. The attackers rode away, laughing their leader's voice, carrying across the canyon with words that chilled Red Hawk's blood. "Tell Frank Tully that Clara Hammond won't be sharing any more secrets." The name hit him like a physical blow. Frank Tully, the man who had murdered Marie and walked free because Sheriff Hammond had ruled it self-defense. As the broken carriage settled deeper into the gorge, Red Hawk began his descent, knowing that saving this woman might destroy everything he believed about justice and revenge. The rescue took 6 hours of painstaking work. Red Hawk's rope-calloused hands bleeding as he maneuvered down the treacherous cliff face. Clara drifted in and out of consciousness, her body broken, but alive a miracle, considering the fall that should have killed her. Her left leg was shattered, twisted at an angle that made Red Hawk's stomach clench, and blood matted her auburn hair where her head had struck the carriage door. But it was the blanket clutched in her arms that made him pause. It was tiny, meant for an infant, and stained with blood that had long since turned brown. When he finally managed to extract her from the wreckage, she was delirious with pain and fever. "Samuel," she whispered, her green eyes focusing on something Red Hawk couldn't see. "I'm sorry, baby. Mama's so sorry." The words were broken by sobs that seemed to tear from her very soul, and Red Hawk found himself speaking in the Cheyenne tongue, the lullabies Marie had sung to comfort frightened children during the worst of the Indian Wars. Clara's eyes snapped to his face with sudden clarity, her breathing steadying as if the ancient words had power to heal more than physical wounds. "Who are you?" She managed, her voice hoarse from screaming. "Someone who understands loss." Red Hawk replied, and began the dangerous journey to his hidden camp in the mountains above. His refuge was a cave system that the Cheyenne had used for generations, hidden behind a waterfall that masked both sight and sound from the outside world. Red Hawk had stocked it with supplies over the years, blankets, food, medicines made from desert plants that his grandmother had taught him to prepare. As he tended Clara's wounds with hands gentler than his scarred appearance suggested, she drifted between wakefulness and nightmares that made her cry out in languages of grief that transcended words. The broken leg would heal but slowly, and the head injury had left her with dizzy spells that made walking impossible. For now she was trapped with a man she had every reason to fear, in a place where screams would echo forever without reaching civilization. In Copper Creek, Sheriff Tom Hammond received word of his wife's accident, with the kind of composure that came from years of hiding his true feelings. The deputy who brought the news was young and earnest, his face pale with the gravity of his report. "Found the carriage at the bottom of Widow's Gorge, Sheriff. No sign of Mrs. Hammond, but there's blood on the wreckage. Dr. Marsh examined the scene and said it looks like she must have fallen out during the crash. We've got search parties combing the area, but with the river running high." Tom nodded grimly, but something in his eyes suggested relief rather than grief. He had been expecting this news for weeks, ever since Clara had started asking questions about cases that were supposed to stay buried. Night fell over the mountains like a black shroud, and with it came the sounds that made Clara's blood freeze in her veins. The howl started low and distant, a lonesome cry that seemed to carry all the loneliness of the desert wind. But it grew closer with each repetition, until it echoed from the rocks just outside their cave. Clara's breathing quickened to panic as memories of Samuel's final night crashed over her, the wolves that had gotten into the chicken coop, the way she had run outside without thinking, leaving her baby alone for just a moment. Just one moment that had stretched into eternity. "They won't come near the fire," Red Hawk said quietly, but Clara was already spiraling into the kind of terror that made rational thought impossible. Her hands shook as she gripped the blood-stained blanket, her green eyes wide with a fear that had nothing to do with wolves and everything to do with the guilt that had been eating her alive for months. "I left him." She whispered, the words torn from her throat like confessions before an altar. "I heard the noise, and I ran outside, and I left Samuel alone. And when I came back..." Red Hawk watched her, carefully recognizing the signs of a mind at war with itself. He had seen the same look in Marie's eyes during her final days, when the weight of secrets had grown too heavy to bear. The wolf appeared at the cave mouth like a ghost materialized from moonlight, silver gray and massive, its yellow eyes reflecting the firelight with predatory intelligence. Clara's scream echoed through the chamber as she pressed herself against the far wall. But Red Hawk moved with fluid grace, his hands empty of weapons as he stepped between Clara and the beast. He spoke in Cheyenne, his voice carrying the authority of one who understood the language of wild things, and slowly, impossibly, the wolf's stance shifted from aggressive to curious. It regarded Red Hawk for a long moment, then turned and melted back into the darkness from which it had come. How? Clara breathed, her voice barely audible above the crackling fire. Red Hawk settled beside her close enough that she could see the intricate beadwork on his leather vest, each pattern telling a story of loss and survival. "Marie taught me," he said simply. "My sister believed that all creatures understand grief, that pain creates a language that crosses all boundaries. The wolves, they recognize kindness in the broken." Clara studied his face in the firelight, noting the scar that marked him as a warrior, and the gentleness that marked him as something more. "What happened to her?" she asked, though something in his eyes warned her that the answer might break what remained of her heart. Far below in Copper Creek, Frank Tully received a report that made his weathered face split into a grin that held no warmth. His informant was nervous, shifting from foot to foot in the smoky back room of the Dusty Rose Saloon, where Tully conducted his business affairs. "Carriage went over the edge, clean as you please." The man said, his hat clutched in trembling hands. "No body found yet, but Doc Marsh says nobody could survive that fall. Even if she did, the desert will finish what the rock started." Tully poured himself a whiskey and contemplated the amber liquid with satisfaction. Clara Hammond had been asking too many questions about her baby's death, questions that could unravel years of careful corruption if the wrong people started listening. Now she was silent forever, and Sheriff Tom Hammond would be too grief-stricken to cause trouble for anyone. But Tully's satisfaction was tempered by a nagging worry about loose ends. The woman had been getting closer to the truth about Samuel's death, closer to discovering the network of corruption that stretched from Dr. Marsh's midnight house calls to the sheriff's deliberate incompetence. If she had shared her suspicions with anyone else, if she had hidden evidence somewhere. Tully's fingers drummed against the table as he considered contingencies. Perhaps it was time to pay Sheriff Hammond a visit to offer condolences and gauge how much the lawman really knew about his wife's accidents. The second day brought with it a test that nearly shattered what remained of Clara's resolve. Little Wolf appeared at the cave entrance, like a vision from one of Red Hawk's stories, a Cheyenne boy of perhaps 8 years, his dark eyes wide with fear and exhaustion. He spoke rapidly in his native tongue, his small hands gesturing frantically toward the valley below, and Red Hawk's face darkened with understanding. "They have taken others," he translated grimly. "Tully's men are hunting my people, looking for information about survivors from the Gorge. They have Little Wolf's grandfather." Clara struggled to her feet, despite the agony that shot through her broken leg, her green eyes blazing with a determination that surprised them both. "We have to help him," she said, though the effort of standing left her swaying dangerously. Red Hawk caught her before she could fall, his strong hands gentle on her shoulders. "You can barely walk," he pointed out, but Clara's jaw was set with stubborn purpose. "Then I'll crawl if I have to. No child should suffer because of me." The words carried weight beyond their immediate meaning, and Red Hawk found himself remembering Marie's words about the power of broken hearts to create unexpected heroes. The decision to move came with agonizing deliberation. Clara's leg would not support her weight, but Red Hawk fashioned a crude crutch from a straight branch and strips of leather, wrapping it with cloth torn from her petticoat. Each step was torture that left her gasping and pale, but she pressed forward with the kind of determination that had seen pioneers cross impossible terrain in search of impossible dreams. Little Wolf walked beside her, his small hand occasionally touching her elbow in wordless encouragement and Clara found herself thinking of Samuel. How he would have been walking by now. How his hand would have felt small and trusting in hers. They made slow progress through terrain that seemed designed to test human endurance. The New Mexico mountains rose around them, like the bones of some ancient giant, their peaks knife-sharp against a sky that burned with merciless heat. Red Hawk moved ahead, scouting for signs of Tully's men, while Clara and Little Wolf followed his trail through ravines that offered precious shade and water from hidden springs. The boy proved to be a capable guide, pointing out handholds and safe passages with the confidence of one raised in this harsh landscape. But Clara could see the worry that clouded his young features whenever he thought no one was watching. It was Little Wolf who spotted the smoke first, a thin column rising from a valley floor that should have been empty. Red Hawk's expression grew grim as he studied the distant fire through eyes that had seen too many similar scenes. "They are torturing him for information," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of old pain. "Grandfather is strong, but—" Clara understood without words what remained unspoken. Time was running out, and every moment they delayed brought more suffering to an innocent man whose only crime was belonging to a race that white men had decided was expendable. The rescue attempt began at sunset, when the desert air finally began to cool, and shadows provided cover for their approach. Clara remained hidden with Little Wolf in a cluster of boulders that offered both concealment and a clear view of the camp below, while Red Hawk moved like a ghost through terrain that seemed impossible to navigate silently. She watched him disappear into darkness that seemed to swallow him completely, leaving only the distant glow of the torturer's fire and the sound of her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. What followed was 20 minutes of terror that felt like hours. Clara strained her ears for sounds of conflict, for gunshots, or cries that would tell her whether Red Hawk had been discovered, but the desert held its secrets close. Little Wolf pressed against her side, his small body trembling with tension, and Clara found herself whispering prayers to a God she wasn't sure was listening anymore. When the gunshot finally came sharp and clear in the desert air, her heart nearly stopped. Then another shot and another, and Clara knew that whatever happened next, nothing would ever be the same. Red Hawk emerged from the darkness, carrying a burden that made Clara's breath catch in her throat. The old Cheyenne was barely conscious, his weathered face marked by burns and cuts that spoke of systematic cruelty, but his eyes were alert and filled with pride for the grandson who watched from the rocks above. He told them nothing, Red Hawk said as he carefully lowered the elder to the ground. But they know someone survived the gorge. They will be searching for us now with the fury of men who have been made to look foolish. Clara understood the implications without explanation. Their sanctuary in the mountains was no longer safe, and traveling with an injured man would slow them to a crawl that would make them easy prey for Tully's hunters. The night brought with it a decision that would test every principle Clara had ever held about right and wrong. As they tended the grandfather's wounds in a shallow cave that offered minimal protection from pursuit, Little Wolf produced something that made Clara's world tilt on its axis. It was a locket, silver and delicate, engraved with roses, that Clara recognized with stomach-churning certainty. She had seen it before, hanging around the neck of a young Cheyenne woman who had come to Copper Creek 6 months ago seeking work as a seamstress. A woman who had called herself Marie and who had smiled shyly when Clara had complimented her beautiful baby. "Or, where did you get this?" Clara whispered, her hands trembling as she held the locket up to the firelight. Little Wolf spoke rapidly to Red Hawk, his young voice carrying an urgency that made the warrior's face go stone still. Red Hawk translated slowly, as if the words were being torn from his throat. "He says his Aunt Marie gave it to him before she died. She said a white woman with sad eyes had given it to her, a woman who had lost her baby, and wanted Marie to have something beautiful because Marie had been kind to her." Clara's vision blurred as understanding crashed over her like a landslide. Marie Red Hawk's murdered sister was the same Marie who had come to her door that terrible night 6 months ago, offering to help care for Samuel while Clara attended a town meeting about the new schoolhouse. The memory hit Clara with the force of a physical blow. She had been hesitant to leave Samuel with a stranger, but Marie's gentle manner and obvious love for children had won her over. "I have 3 little brothers," Marie had assured her in the careful English she was still learning. "I know babies." Clara had left them together in the parlor, Samuel sleeping peacefully in his cradle, while Marie hummed soft lullabies in the Cheyenne tongue. The meeting had run longer than expected, heated debates about funding and location that had stretched well past sunset, and Clara had returned home to find the house dark and silent. Too silent. Samuel's cradle had been empty, the window above it standing open to the desert night. Clara had screamed until her throat was raw, had torn through the house looking for some sign of what had happened, but Marie and Samuel had simply vanished like smoke on the wind. It was Tom who had found them the next morning, miles from town, in a ravine where coyotes had... Clara's mind shied away from the details, but Tom's explanation had been clear. Marie had tried to kidnap Samuel, had fallen while fleeing through the darkness, and both had died in the fall. "Thank God you weren't with them," Tom had set his arms around Clara as she sobbed. "Thank God that Indian woman didn't take you too." But now, staring at the locket that Marie had treasured enough to pass on to her nephew Clara, felt the foundation of her grief shifting beneath her feet. If Marie had been Red Hawk's sister, if she had been the kind of person who rescued wolves and sang lullabies to frighten children, and then everything Clara had believed about that night was wrong. Marie hadn't been a kidnapper. She had been a protector. And if Marie had died trying to save Samuel from some unknown threat, then Clara's guilt was nothing compared to the injustice of what had really happened in Copper Creek 6 months ago. Marie didn't kidnap Samuel. Clara breathed the words falling into the silence like stones into still water. She was trying to save him. Red Hawk's dark eyes fixed on her face with an intensity that made her feel naked and exposed. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice carefully controlled, but carrying undertones of danger that made the hair on Clara's neck stand on end. Clara forced herself to meet his gaze, knowing that her next words would either damn her forever or begin to heal wounds that had festered for months. "Someone was threatening my baby." She said the truth spilling out of her like blood from a mortal wound. I'd been getting notes warnings that Samuel wasn't safe. Dr. Marsh said they were the delusions of a grief-stricken woman, that losing a child was making me see threats where none existed. But Marie believed me. She said she would watch over Samuel while I went to the town meeting, said she would protect him from anyone who tried to hurt him. Clara's voice broke as the full weight of her betrayal crashed over her. When I found them gone, I thought, God help me, I thought she was the threat. I thought she had taken him to hurt me. I never told anyone that she was trying to help. I let them say she was a kidnapper. I let them blame her for my baby's death. The silence that followed was so complete that Clara could hear her own heartbeat drumming in her ears. Red Hawk stared at her with an expression she couldn't read, his scarred hands clenched into fists that spoke of barely contained violence. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft and deadly. My sister died protecting your child from the same men who threw you into that gorge. She died believing she had failed, believing that her inability to save one white baby made her unworthy of the love our people showed her. And you? You let the world believe she was a murderer. Clara wanted to protest, wanted to explain how grief and shock had clouded her judgment. But the words died in her throat when she saw the pain in Red Hawk's eyes. This was a wound that went deeper than flesh, a betrayal that had poisoned his sister's final moments and his own quest for justice. I'm sorry, she whispered, knowing the words were inadequate and hollow. I was so lost in my own grief that I couldn't see the truth. Marie died a hero and I made her a villain. I don't know how to live with that. Little Wolf had been listening to their conversation with the wide-eyed intensity of a child who understands more than adults give him credit for. Now he spoke softly to Red Hawk, his young voice carrying a wisdom that seemed impossible for his years. Red Hawk's expression shifted as he listened, some of the harsh anger fading to be replaced by something that might have been understanding. He says Marie would want us to save the living rather than mourn the dead. Red Hawk translated. He says his aunt believed that forgiveness was stronger than revenge, that healing broken things was more important than punishing the breakers. Before Clara could respond to Little Wolf's wisdom, the sound of approaching horses cut through the desert night like a blade through silk. Red Hawk was on his feet instantly, his rifle in his hands, as he moved to the cave mouth and peered into the darkness beyond. What he saw there made his face go pale beneath its weathered bronze. 8 riders, he reported grimly. Tully's men, and they're heading straight for us. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs as she realized that their hiding place had been compromised, that somehow Tully's hunters had tracked them to this seemingly impossible location. The truth came from Little Wolf, his confession delivered in rapid Cheyenne that made Red Hawk's face darken with betrayal and understanding. The Old One told them. Red Hawk translated, his voice heavy with grief and anger. Grandfather gave them our location to make the torture stop. He held out as long as he could, but... Clara looked at the old Cheyenne's battered face and felt her heart break for what this revelation would do to Little Wolf's faith in the adults who were supposed to protect him. But there was no time for comfort or recrimination. Tully's men were close enough that they could hear the horses' hooves striking stone, close enough that the glow from their torches painted the cave walls in dancing shadows. Red Hawk made the decision with the swift certainty of a man who had faced impossible odds before and survived through decisive action. There is another way out, he said, shouldering his pack and checking his weapons. A passage that leads to the valley floor, but it's dangerous even for healthy people. With your leg... Clara cut him off with a gesture, her green eyes blazing with determination that surprised them both. I'll manage, she said simply. We're not dying here tonight. The escape route was a nightmare of narrow ledges and crumbling handholds that would have challenged experienced climbers under the best conditions. Clara's broken leg screamed protest with every movement, but she forced herself forward through sheer will and the knowledge that failure meant death or capture for all of them. Red Hawk moved ahead with Little Wolf, testing each foothold and finding the safest path through terrain that seemed designed to kill the unwary. Behind them, they could hear Tully's men reaching the cave, their voices raised in frustration and anger as they discovered their quarry had vanished. It was during the most treacherous part of the descent that disaster struck. Clara's makeshift crutch caught between 2 rocks and snapped, sending her tumbling toward a ledge that jutted out over a 100-foot drop. Red Hawk lunged for her with reflexes honed by years of survival, catching her wrist just as she went over the edge. For a moment, they hung suspended Clara's weight, pulling them both toward the abyss, while Little Wolf pressed himself against the cliff face and tried not to look down. Well, let me go. Clara gasped, her fingers slipping in Red Hawk's grip. You can't hold us both. But Red Hawk's response was to shift his grip and begin the agonizing process of hauling her back up to safety, his muscles screaming protest as he fought against gravity and time. Marie would never forgive me. He grunted between clenched teeth. And Little Wolf needs to see that some adults keep their promises. With strength born of desperation and determination, he managed to pull Clara back onto the ledge just as the sounds of pursuit grew closer. They reached the valley floor as dawn painted the eastern sky in shades of rose and gold, their bodies battered and exhausted but alive. Red Hawk knew that their lead was temporary at best. Tully's men would find the escape route soon enough, and the pursuit would resume with deadly intensity. But the valley offered opportunities that the mountains had denied horses that could be stolen settlements, where they might find allies, and terrain that favored the hunted over the hunters. "There is a place," Red Hawk said as they took shelter in a stand of cottonwoods beside a stream that ran clear and cold from the high peaks. "An old friend who might help us, but reaching him means crossing open ground where we'll be visible for miles." Clara studied the landscape with eyes that had been sharpened by days of running and hiding. The valley stretched before them like a vast ocean of grass and sage, broken by occasional mesas that rose like islands from the desert floor. It was beautiful in the harsh way of untamed places, but it offered precious little cover for travelers who needed to remain unseen. "How far?" she asked, knowing that the answer would determine whether they had any real chance of escape. 10 miles, Red Hawk replied. "Maybe 12. But they will see us coming long before we reach safety." It was Little Wolf who provided the solution, his young mind seeing possibilities that adult caution had overlooked. He pointed to a herd of wild horses grazing near the stream, their coats shining like burnished copper in the morning light. "If we look like horses from a distance," he said in careful English that marked him as unusually intelligent for his age, "maybe they won't know we're people until we're too close to catch." Clara stared at the boy in amazement, and then at Red Hawk, who was already nodding with something that might have been approval. "It could work," Red Hawk admitted. "If we stay low and move with the herd, keep the animals between us and any watchers." Clara felt hope stir in her chest for the first time in days. It was a desperate plan requiring luck and timing that they had no guarantee of finding. But it was better than walking openly across ground that would make them perfect targets for anyone with a rifle and patience. "Then let's be horses," she said, and was surprised to find herself almost smiling despite their desperate circumstances. The next 3 hours were among the most surreal of Clara's life. Moving bent almost double to avoid being silhouetted against the sky, staying close enough to the wild horses to mask their human scent, but far enough away to avoid spooking the animals, they made their way across terrain that seemed endless and exposed. Clara's broken leg throbbed with every step, but adrenaline and determination kept her moving long past the point where rational thought would have demanded rest. Red Hawk moved like a ghost beside her, his presence both comforting and slightly unnerving, as she realized how deadly he could be when circumstances demanded violence. Little Wolf proved to be the perfect companion for their strange journey, his natural affinity for animals keeping the horses calm even when the humans' movements threatened to scatter the herd. He sang softly in Cheyenne as they walked lullabies and horse songs that seemed to weave a kind of magic around them, making them part of the landscape rather than intruders upon it. Clara found herself listening to the melodies, with growing recognition, remembering how Marie had hummed similar songs while caring for Samuel. The connection between the siblings was clear in every note, a shared heritage of music and love that death had not been able to break. They were within 2 miles of their destination when the trap closed around them with the precision of a military operation. Tully's men rose from concealment among the rocks and sage-like phantoms materializing from desert heat, their rifles trained on the fleeing trio with professional calm. "Well, well," came a voice that Clara recognized with a chill of pure terror. Mrs. Clara Hammond, come back from the dead, and her red-skinned savior thoughtful enough to bring a little bonus for our trouble. Frank Tully stepped into view with the confident swagger of a man who held all the cards, his weathered face split by a grin that held no warmth or mercy. At 52, Tully was the kind of man who had been forged by frontier violence and shaped by the kind of corruption that thrived in places where law was whatever the strongest man said it was. His pale eyes held the flat reptilian coldness of a predator who had learned to enjoy the hunt as much as the kill. The star on his vest proclaimed him a deputy sheriff. But Clara knew that the badge was nothing more than decoration on a man who served only his own interests and the interests of those who paid him well enough to ensure his loyalty. "You've led us quite a chase, Mrs. Hammond." Tully continued his voice, carrying the false friendliness of a snake charmer. "Had us worried when we couldn't find your body at the bottom of that gorge. Started thinking maybe you'd survive to tell tales about your little accident. Maybe share some of those interesting theories you've been developing about your baby's death." Clara's blood turned to ice at the confirmation that Samuel's death had been murder, that her worst fears about that night had been terrifyingly accurate. "You killed my son," she said, her voice steady despite the terror that clawed at her throat. Tully's grin widened, showing teeth that were yellowed by tobacco and years of neglect. "Now, Mrs. Hammond, let's not go jumping to conclusions. Your boy died in a tragic accident, just like the official report says. Of course, accidents do happen when people start poking around in business that doesn't concern them, asking questions about medicine shortages and missing morphine supplies." Clara felt the pieces of a puzzle clicking into place, understanding dawning like a sunrise that brought revelation instead of hope. "Dr. Marsh was selling medical supplies to you," she said, her mind racing through months of observations that suddenly made terrible sense. Morphine, laudanum, anything that could be sold for profit. And when I started noticing discrepancies in Samuel's treatment, when I started asking why a simple fever required so much medicine. Tully nodded approvingly, like a teacher pleased with a student's progress. "Smart woman. Too smart for your own good, as it turns out. See, Dr. Marsh got nervous when you started paying attention to his inventory. Worried you might mention your concerns to that husband of yours. Maybe get the sheriff interested in a medical audit." The truth hit Clara like a physical blow, stealing her breath and making her legs weak beneath her. "You killed Samuel to keep me quiet. You murdered my baby to protect a drug-selling scheme." Tully's expression never changed, but something flickered in his pale eyes that might have been annoyance at having to explain something so obvious. "Your boy was just insurance, Mrs. Hammond. Way to make sure you were too grief-stricken to cause trouble. Of course, Dr. Marsh overdid it with the morphine, and the kid died faster than we planned. But it worked out for the best. Nothing keeps a woman quiet like a dead baby." Red Hawk had been silent through this exchange, but Clara could feel tension radiating from him like heat from a forge. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the kind of controlled fury that preceded volcanic eruptions. "And Marie, what was her crime?" Tully turned his attention to the Cheyenne warrior with the casual indifference of a man discussing livestock. "Your sister was in the wrong place at the wrong time, Redskin. Came to the Hammond house just as we were dealing with the baby problem. Tried to run with the kid when she figured out what was happening. We couldn't let her reach town with that kind of story." Clara's vision blurred with tears of rage and grief as she understood the full scope of the horror that had destroyed her family. Marie had died trying to save Samuel from the very men Clara had trusted with their lives. Dr. Marsh, who had delivered Samuel and cared for him through every childhood illness, had betrayed that trust for money. Tully, wearing the badge of law enforcement, had orchestrated murder with the casual efficiency of a man swatting flies. And Tom. Her heart clenched as she realized that Tom must have known. There was no way the sheriff could have missed evidence of a conspiracy that involved his own deputy and the town doctor. "Where does Tom fit into this?" she asked, dreading the answer, but needing to know the full extent of the betrayal. Tully's grin turned positively wolfish at the question. "Sheriff Hammond, well, let's just say your husband has been very understanding about the need for flexible law enforcement in a frontier town. Amazing how cooperative a man becomes when you have photographs of him with whores and documentation of his gambling debts to very unsavory people in Santa Fe. The revelation that Tom was being blackmailed rather than willingly corrupt should have brought Clara some measure of relief, but instead, it only deepened her despair. If Tom was a victim rather than a perpetrator, then he was trapped just as surely as she was forced to watch his wife suffer and his integrity crumble under Tully's threats. He doesn't know about Samuel, she said more to herself than to Tully. He thinks it was really an accident. Tully nodded with mock sympathy. Course he does. Good man, your husband. Just not quite good enough to resist temptation when it comes wearing a pretty face and carrying a bottle of whiskey. Little Wolf had been pressed against Red Hawk's side throughout the conversation, his young face pale with terror, but his dark eyes bright with intelligence that missed nothing. Now he tugged at Red Hawk's sleeve and whispered something in rapid Cheyenne that made the warrior's scarred face go stone still. Red Hawk listened intently, then nodded almost imperceptibly. He says there are more horses coming, Red Hawk translated quietly. From the direction of town, many horses riding hard. Tully heard the exchange, and his grin faltered slightly as he strained his ears for sounds of approaching riders. Must be Sheriff Hammond with a search party, he said, but there was uncertainty in his voice now. No matter. We'll tell him we found his wife's body and the Redskins who killed her. Clean and simple. But Clara caught something in Tully's expression that suggested he wasn't entirely confident in his ability to control whatever was coming toward them across the desert floor. The riders appeared on the horizon, like a mirage resolving into reality, a dozen men on horseback, moving with the purposeful urgency of a military unit, rather than the random organization of a search party. As they drew closer, Clara could make out the distinctive blue uniforms and brass buttons that marked them as cavalry soldiers, their presence on civilian territory, suggesting official business of the most serious kind. Tully's confidence evaporated like morning mist as he recognized the implications of federal involvement in what should have been a local matter. Shit. He muttered his casual profanity, carrying more weight than the most elaborate curse. Federal troops meant federal jurisdiction, federal investigation, and federal justice that couldn't be bought or intimidated by frontier corruption. Clara felt hope stir in her chest for the first time since the ambush. But Red Hawk's expression remained carefully neutral. He had learned not to trust the blue uniforms, had seen too many promises broken and too many treaties ignored to believe that federal intervention meant justice for his people. The cavalry unit reached them within minutes, their horses lathered with sweat and their faces grim with purpose. Their leader was a captain whose insignia proclaimed him a veteran of frontier service, his weathered face marked by the kind of lines that came from making hard decisions in impossible circumstances. Deputy Tully. He said, his voice carrying the crisp authority of military command. You're under arrest for the murder of Marie Blackbird and conspiracy to commit federal crimes on Indian territory. Tully's face went ashen as the charges were read, but his hand dropped toward his gun with the reflexive motion of a man who had always solved problems with violence. Now, hold on, Captain. He said, his voice taking on the wheedling tone of a man trying to talk his way out of a noose. There's been some misunderstanding here. I'm a duly appointed deputy sheriff of Copper Creek, and these are criminals I'm bringing in for justice. The captain's expression never changed, but Clara noticed how his hand rested casually on his saber hilt. Marie Blackbird was under federal protection as a witness in a case involving illegal weapons sales to hostile tribes. The captain continued his words, falling into the desert silence like stones into still water. Her murder triggered a federal investigation that has been ongoing for 6 months. We have testimony from Dr. Marsh, who decided that cooperation was preferable to hanging. We know about the morphine sales, the murdered child, and the blackmail scheme involving Sheriff Hammond. Clara's world tilted as she processed the revelation that Marie had been working with federal agents, that her presence in Copper Creek had been part of a larger investigation into frontier corruption. The knowledge that Marie had been a hero in death as well as life brought a mixture of vindication and grief that threatened to overwhelm her already fragile emotional state. She was trying to save Samuel. Clara whispered the words, carrying the weight of months of misplaced guilt. She died protecting my baby from monsters. Red Hawk's reaction to the news was more complex, his scarred face cycling through emotions that Clara couldn't entirely read. Pride in his sister's courage warred with grief for opportunities lost, relief at her vindication, battled with anger at injustices that could never be undone. She always said that courage was doing the right thing, even when it cost everything, he said quietly. I thought it was just something she told herself to make peace with an unjust world. I never knew she was actually fighting back. Tully's response to the closing trap was as violent as Clara had expected, his hand clearing leather with the speed of a man who had survived numerous gunfights through superior reflexes and ruthless determination. But Red Hawk was faster, his rifle swinging up to center on Tully's chest before the deputy's pistol could find its target. For Marie, he said simply, and pulled the trigger. The shot echoed across the valley like thunder, and Frank Tully crumpled to the desert floor with a hole through his heart and a look of surprise frozen on his weathered face. The cavalry captain made no move to arrest Red Hawk for the killing, his expression suggesting that justice had been served regardless of legal technicalities. Marie Blackbird was working under federal authority, he said by way of explanation. Her brother has the right to exact justice under both federal law and tribal custom. The case is closed. Clara stared at Tully's body and felt something that might have been satisfaction, though it was tempered by the knowledge that revenge could never restore what had been lost. Little Wolf's reaction to the violence was more complex than Clara had expected from a child his age. He moved to Tully's body with the fearless curiosity of youth, studying the man who had brought so much pain to his family, with an expression that held no hatred, only a kind of solemn acceptance that death was part of the natural order of things. He can't hurt anyone else now, he said in careful English, his young voice carrying wisdom that seemed impossible for his years. Aunt Marie would be happy that the hurting is over. The ride back to Copper Creek was a journey through landscape that looked the same, but felt fundamentally different to Clara. The desert that had been hostile territory filled with hidden threats now seemed merely harsh rather than actively malevolent. The mountains that had hidden enemies and death now offered the neutral indifference of natural forces that cared nothing for human drama. It was as if lifting the veil of corruption had somehow purified the land itself, restoring it to the honest brutality of a place where survival depended on strength and wisdom rather than treachery and betrayal. Tom Hammond was waiting for them at the sheriff's office, his face a mask of barely controlled emotion that Clara recognized as the expression he wore when duty warred with personal feeling. The cavalry captain had ridden ahead to prepare him for what was coming, and Tom's first words were directed at Clara with a desperation that spoke of months of accumulated guilt and fear. I tried to protect you, he said, his voice cracking with the weight of secrets finally brought into the light. Tully had photographs, debts I couldn't pay, threats against you if I didn't cooperate. I thought if I just played along until I could find a way out. Clara studied her husband's face, and I saw the man she had fallen in love with beneath the layers of compromise and fear that had accumulated over the months of their marriage's slow disintegration. You didn't know about Samuel. She said the words more statement than question. Tom's face crumpled with grief and self-recrimination that spoke of a pain equal to her own. I suspected something was wrong, but Tully convinced me it was natural causes complicated by my gambling problems. Said if I pushed too hard for an investigation, he'd make sure everyone knew about the debts and the women and... Tom's voice trailed off into silence that held more weight than any confession. Red Hawk watched this reunion with the detached interest of a man who had learned not to expect happy endings from interactions with white authority. But Clara surprised him by turning from her husband to face him directly, her green eyes bright with tears that spoke of grief transformed into something approaching peace. "Thank you," she said simply, "for saving my life, for showing me the truth about Marie, for giving my son's death meaning by making sure justice was served." Red Hawk nodded acknowledgement, but his response carried undertones that suggested the conversation was far from over. "There is something else you should know," he said, his scarred face grave with the weight of secrets that had been carried too long in silence. "About the night Samuel and Marie died, about things that the federal investigation didn't uncover because they happened before the troops arrived." Clara felt her stomach clench with apprehension, wondering what other revelations could possibly remain after everything that had already been exposed. Tom stepped closer to his wife, his protective instincts overriding his own guilt and shame. Red Hawk reached into his leather vest and withdrew something that made Clara's breath catch in her throat. It was a piece of cloth, torn and stained, but unmistakably from Samuel's nightgown, the fabric she had sewn with her own hands during the happy months when she was preparing for his birth. "Marie managed to get him away from Tully's men," Red Hawk said quietly. "She almost made it to safety. But there was someone else there that night, someone who helped Tully find them in the darkness." Clara's world tilted as she processed the implications of Red Hawk's words. If Marie had successfully escaped with Samuel, if she had been on the verge of reaching safety, then someone had betrayed them to Tully at the last possible moment. Someone who knew where Marie would run, who understood her escape routes and her hiding places. Someone who had been trusted enough to get close before revealing their true allegiance. "Asa who?" Tom demanded, his hand dropping to his gun with the reflexive motion of a lawman facing a threat. But Red Hawk's answer came from an unexpected direction as Little Wolf stepped forward with something clutched in his small hands. It was a button brass and distinctive torn from a coat during what must have been a struggle. Clara recognized it, immediately had seen its match dozens of times on the coat that Dr. Marsh wore when making his house calls around Copper Creek. Dr. Marsh was there. Clara breathed understanding, flooding through her like ice water. He followed Marie, and Samuel told Tully where to find them. The betrayal cut deeper than anything that had come before, the knowledge that the man who had delivered Samuel and cared for him through his brief life had ultimately been responsible for his murder. Dr. Marsh, who had sat beside Samuel's tiny coffin and offered meaningless platitudes about God's will and natural causes, had been the architect of his death. Tom's face went pale as he processed the implications of his wife's revelation. "Marsh has been treating you for months," he said slowly. "The laudanum, the sedatives, all those visits when I was away on business." Clara felt sick as she realized how thoroughly she had been manipulated, how her grief and guilt had been weaponized against her by the very man she had trusted to help her heal. "He was keeping me drugged," she said, her voice hollow with the horror of understanding, "making sure I was too confused and dependent to ask the right questions." The confrontation with Dr. Marsh took place in his own office, surrounded by the medical instruments and bottles of medicine that had been the tools of his double life. The elderly physician's face crumpled with resignation when the cavalry captain placed him under arrest, his weathered hands shaking, as he realized that his long game of deception and profit had finally reached its inevitable conclusion. "It wasn't supposed to go that far," he said, his voice carrying the petulant tone of a man who expected sympathy for his good intentions. "The morphine sales were just to make ends meet, help with debts that accumulated faster than my income. When Mrs. Hammond started asking questions, you decided to murder a baby to protect your drug business." Clara said, her voice steady despite the rage that burned in her chest like molten steel. Dr. Marsh flinched at the blunt accusation, his eyes darting around the room, as if looking for escape routes that didn't exist. Samuel was already sick. He protested weakly. The fever was real, the danger was real. I just accelerated the natural course of the illness. And the Indian woman was going to expose everything, ruin lives that didn't deserve to be destroyed over a simple business arrangement. Red Hawk stepped forward with the fluid grace of a predator moving in for a kill. His scarred hands steady as they gripped the rifle that had already claimed one life that day. My sister died believing she had failed to save an innocent child. He said, his voice carrying the cold fury of a man who had found his target after years of searching. She carried that guilt to her grave because you convinced everyone that she was a kidnapper instead of a hero. Dr. Marsh backed against his desk, his face pale with terror as he realized that federal protection didn't extend to situations where justice and vengeance had become indistinguishable. But it was Clara who stopped Red Hawk's advance, her hand gentle on his arm as she stepped between him and the man who had destroyed her family. "He's not worth it," she said quietly. "Marie wouldn't want you to become a killer for her sake. She'd want him to live with what he's done to face justice instead of receiving mercy through death." Red Hawk studied her face for a long moment and then slowly lowered his rifle, with the grudging acceptance of a man who recognized wisdom even when it conflicted with his deepest desires. Dr. Marsh's arrest marked the end of a conspiracy that had corrupted Copper Creek for years. But Clara found that justice brought less satisfaction than she had expected. Samuel was still dead, Marie was still dead. And the months of grief and guilt she had endured couldn't be erased by the knowledge that she hadn't been responsible for her son's death. Healing, she was beginning to understand, was a process that couldn't be rushed by revenge or accelerated by vindication. The days that followed passed in a blur of testimony and legal proceedings that gradually restored some semblance of order to a town that had been living under the shadow of corruption for longer than most people had realized. Clara found herself at the center of a media storm that attracted attention from newspapers as far away as Denver and Santa Fe. Her story of survival and justice resonating with readers who were hungry for tales of frontier heroism. In an age when such stories were becoming increasingly rare, but it was the quiet moments that meant the most to Clara. Conversations with Red Hawk about Marie's life and dreams time spent with Little Wolf as he taught her the songs that his aunt had loved, gradual reconciliation with Tom as they worked to rebuild a marriage that had been damaged by circumstances beyond their control. The process was slow and sometimes painful, requiring them to confront truths about themselves and each other that might have been easier to leave buried. 3 weeks after Tully's death, Red Hawk came to Clara with news that she had been both expecting and dreading. The federal investigation was complete, his testimony was no longer needed, and it was time for him to return to his people, with Little Wolf and the grandfather, who had recovered from his injuries with the resilience of a man who had survived worse traumas. "We're going back to the reservation," he said simply. "Little Wolf needs to grow up among his own people, and I need to find a way to honor Marie's memory that doesn't involve looking for new enemies to kill." Clara felt her heart clench at the thought of losing the unlikely friendship that had sustained her through the darkest period of her life. Red Hawk had become more than a rescuer or an ally. He had become a bridge to understanding that extended beyond the boundaries of race and culture that typically divided frontier communities. "Will I see you again?" she asked, knowing that the answer would depend on forces larger than personal preference or individual choice. "The land is large, but not infinite." Red Hawk replied with something that might have been a smile. "And Little Wolf has made me promise to teach him English so that he can write letters to the white woman who helped his family find justice. I suspect our paths will cross again when the time is right." Clara nodded, accepting both the promise and the uncertainty that came with frontier life, where relationships were often measured in moments of shared crisis rather than years of comfortable familiarity. The farewell took place at sunrise. The desert air crisp with the promise of another day of brutal heat that would test the endurance of everything that lived in this harsh landscape. Little Wolf presented Clara with a gift that took her breath away. A small leather pouch containing seeds from the wildflowers that grew near Marie's grave, carefully saved and prepared according to Cheyenne tradition. Aunt Marie said flowers make sad places beautiful again, he explained in his careful English. She would want you to have something beautiful to remember her by. Clara accepted the gift with tears that spoke of grief transformed into something approaching gratitude. The seeds represented possibility rather than endings, growth rather than decay, hope rather than despair. As she watched Red Hawk and Little Wolf ride away into the morning light, their figures gradually disappearing into the heat shimmer that rose from the desert floor, she found herself thinking not of all that had been lost, but of all that had been gained through their unlikely friendship. Tom found her there an hour later, still standing in the spot where she had watched their new friends disappear into the vastness of the New Mexico territory. His presence beside her felt different now, less weighted with unspoken guilt and hidden secrets, more honest in its simplicity and shared purpose. "Are you all right?" He asked the question, carrying depths of meaning that went far beyond surface concern for her emotional state. "I think I might be." Clara replied, surprised to find that the words were true. The grief for Samuel would never entirely fade, but it had been transformed from something that destroyed to something that motivated, from a source of guilt to a wellspring of determination to prevent other families from suffering similar losses. "We have work to do," she continued, turning to face her husband with eyes that held clarity instead of confusion. "This town needs to heal, and we need to make sure that what happened to Samuel and Marie never happens to anyone else." Tom nodded, understanding without words that their marriage had been tested and found strong enough to survive betrayal, corruption, and the kind of loss that destroyed weaker bonds. They walked back toward town together, their steps synchronized in a way that spoke of partnership rediscovered and purpose shared. Behind them, the desert wind scattered the wildflower seeds that Little Wolf had given Clara, carrying them to places where they would take root and bloom in seasons yet to come. 6 months later, Clara Hammond stood in the garden behind her house, tending to the wildflowers that had grown from Marie's seeds with the kind of stubborn beauty that characterized all living things in the desert Southwest. The plants had thrived despite the harsh conditions, their bright blooms creating a splash of color against the austere landscape that surrounded Copper Creek. Each flower was a reminder of lives lost and friendships forged, of justice served, and healing accomplished through the most unlikely of circumstances. The letter from Little Wolf had arrived that morning, written in the careful English script of a boy who was mastering a second language with the same determination he had shown in surviving the chaos that had claimed his aunt. His words were simple but profound, carrying news of life on the reservation and observations about the changing seasons that revealed a poet's soul beneath the warrior training that was his birthright as a Cheyenne male. "The flowers you planted are blooming here too," he had written. "Red Hawk says they are Marie's way of telling us that beautiful things can grow even in places where terrible things have happened." Clara folded the letter carefully and tucked it into the pocket of her dress, adding it to the growing collection of correspondence that connected her to the new life that Red Hawk and Little Wolf were building among their people. Tom emerged from the house behind her, his face carrying the calm contentment of a man who had found his way back to integrity after a long detour through compromise and fear. "Mrs. Peterson is here to see you," he said, referring to the wife of the new doctor who had replaced Dr. Marsh and brought both competence and honesty to Copper Creek's medical needs. Mrs. Peterson's visit brought news that filled Clara's heart with a mixture of joy and trepidation. She was pregnant again, carrying new life that represented both hope and vulnerability in equal measure. The knowledge that she would have another chance at motherhood was overshadowed by fears that seemed irrational, but felt entirely real worries about protecting this child from the kind of threats that had claimed Samuel, concerns about her ability to love, without the suffocating desperation that grief had taught her. "It's natural to be afraid," Tom said that evening as they sat together on the porch and watched the sun set over the mountains where Clara had found unlikely salvation. "After what we've been through, after what we've lost, it would be stranger if you weren't worried about protecting this baby." Clara leaned against her husband's shoulder and felt the solid reality of his presence, the knowledge that she was no longer alone in her vigilance against threats that might never materialize but could never be entirely dismissed. The baby came in spring, arriving with the dramatic timing of desert storms and the robust health that suggested he would thrive in the harsh environment that had claimed his older brother. Clara held him for the first time with hands that shook not from fear, but from the overwhelming recognition that love was indeed stronger than loss, that healing was possible, even after the most devastating wounds. They named him Samuel, honoring the brother he would never know, but whose memory would be woven into the fabric of his life from his first breath. Red Hawk arrived 3 days after the birth, appearing at their door with the sudden materialization that characterized all his visits to Copper Creek. He carried gifts from the reservation, a cradle board carved by the grandfather, who had survived Tully's torture blankets woven by the women who remembered Marie's kindness, and a small medicine bag prepared by Little Wolf with the solemnity of a child who understood the weight of tradition and responsibility. Marie would have wanted him to be protected by both worlds. Red Hawk explained as he placed the medicine bag gently beside the sleeping infant. Cheyenne and white old ways, and knew all the strength that love can provide. As Red Hawk prepared to leave after his brief visit, he paused at the threshold and turned back to Clara with an expression that held depths of meaning she was still learning to read. "Little Wolf asked me to teach you something," he said, his scarred face softening with something that might have been a smile. "A song that Marie used to sing, something she learned from your Samuel during the time she cared for him. He taught it to her in English, and she translated it into Cheyenne. Now it belongs to both peoples, a bridge between worlds that honors both the living and the dead." The song that Red Hawk taught Clara was simple and haunting, a lullaby that spoke of protection and love in words that transcended language barriers and cultural divisions. As Clara learned the melody and the meaning behind each phrase, she understood that this was Marie's final gift, a connection between the child she had died trying to save and the children who would come after, a promise that love could survive even the most devastating losses, and that healing was always possible for those brave enough to accept it. Years passed, and the story of Clara Hammond's rescue and the corruption that had plagued Copper Creek became the stuff of frontier legend, told and retold around campfires and in saloons throughout the Southwest. But for Clara herself, the true meaning of those events lay not in their dramatic scope, but in their quieter consequences. The friendship that had bridged cultural divides, the justice that had honored the dead, and the healing that had made new life possible. Little Wolf grew into a young man who moved easily between the world of the reservation and the world of the white settlements, carrying messages and maintaining connections that helped ease tensions between communities that had too often viewed each other as enemies. His visits to Copper Creek became an annual tradition, timed to coincide with the blooming of Marie's wildflowers and the anniversary of the events that had changed so many lives. Red Hawk never entirely abandoned his warrior's vigilance, but he channeled it into protection rather than revenge, becoming a voice for justice that commanded respect from both Cheyenne and white authorities. His friendship with the Hammond family remained strong through all the changes that frontier life brought, a testament to the bonds that could be forged in moments of shared crisis and maintained through years of mutual respect and understanding. On the 10th anniversary of Samuel's death and Marie's sacrifice, Clara stood once again in the garden behind her house, surrounded by children who had grown strong and healthy in the harsh beauty of the New Mexico desert. Young Samuel, now 9 years old, played with his younger sisters among the wildflowers that had become a living memorial to the aunt and brother they knew only through stories, but honored through their daily lives. As the sun set over the mountains where Clara had once hung between life and death, she heard the sound of approaching horses and turned to see familiar figures riding toward her house. Red Hawk and Little Wolf, now a young man of 18, with the bearing of a warrior and the wisdom of one who had bridged 2 worlds, dismounted and approached with the easy familiarity of family members returning home after a long journey. "We bring news." Little Wolf said, his English now flawless, but still carrying the careful cadence that marked it as a learned rather than native tongue. "And a gift from the grandmother, who remembers Marie's kindness." He reached into his saddlebags and withdrew something that made Clara's breath catch in her throat, a photograph somehow preserved through years of frontier hardships showing Marie holding a baby who could only be Samuel. The photograph had been taken by a traveling photographer who had visited the reservation shortly before Marie's death, capturing a moment of pure joy as she held the child she had grown to love as her own. In the image, both aunt and nephew were smiling with the unconscious happiness of people who felt safe and loved, their faces bright with the kind of contentment that made Clara understand why Marie had been willing to die to protect that precious bond. She kept it with her always, Red Hawk explained quietly. Even at the end, even when she knew she was dying, she held it close and spoke your son's name with her last breath. The grandmother thought you should have it, now should know that Samuel's last days were filled with love and laughter, despite everything that came after. Clara accepted the photograph with hands that trembled with the weight of grief transformed into gratitude. The image would take its place among the treasures of her household, a reminder that love could transcend death, and that the bonds forged in life could survive even the most devastating losses. As she looked at her son's face in the photograph, she understood that his death had not been meaningless. It had been the catalyst for justice that had saved other lives and forged friendships that would endure for generations. That evening, as the extended family that had grown from tragedy and been strengthened by adversity gathered around the dinner table, Clara listened to the sound of children's laughter mixing with adult conversation and felt the deep contentment that came from knowing that love had indeed proven stronger than loss. The wildflowers in her garden would bloom again next spring, carrying Marie's memory into another season of growth and renewal. And the songs that connected 2 cultures would be passed down to children who understood that healing was always possible for those brave enough to accept it. The desert wind that had once carried threats and danger now brought only the promise of tomorrow. And Clara Hammond knew that she had finally found her way home to a place where the living and the dead could rest in peace together, united by bonds that neither time nor tragedy could ever break.